Their nickname is New York's finest, but a new poll out this week gave the NYPD its lowest approval rating in 14 years. Quinnipiac's survey reported 50% approval of the job that the NYPD is doing, while 42% said they disapprove of the NYPD's work. More praise than criticism, but again, that's still a 14-year low for the department. Add to that 56% of New Yorkers support the department's broken windows policy, which targets low-level criminal offenses with the hopes of deterring greater ones. Meanwhile, 35% say broken windows only leads to neighborhood tensions. Former NYPD Commissioner Ray Kelly told our Dominic Carter this week that he supports the policy. Tonight we're hearing from Brooklyn College Professor Alex Vitale, who says the policy has to go. Professor Vitale, from your writing, you are adamantly opposed to both broken windows and to militarized policing. Let's start with the broken windows. What are your objections with that police policy?
Well, I think there are two things we have to consider. One is that we don't really know that it's the reason for the crime drop. And as a result, we're exacting a lot of serious collateral consequences for people who are being arrested for very minor offenses. Even if it is working, I don't think we can sustain anymore politically arresting tens of thousands of people a year for very low-level offenses like taking up 2 seats on the subway or riding a bicycle on the sidewalk, which puts these people in the criminal justice system with potentially very negative consequences for them long-term. So even if it were working, we need to find some other way of managing crime and disorder problems that doesn't involve this kind of mass criminalization.
We've heard a lot about, and I've reported extensively on marijuana possession arrests, for example, which would appear to be a crime that really somewhat victimless, you could say. But the other examples that you gave, taking up 2 seats in the subway, as minor as that may sound, or using a bicycle on the sidewalk, or subway performers, or what have you, those are not exactly victimless crimes. They're minor crimes, but they do impact other people. Why shouldn't police respond to those?
Well, I think that there are serious crime and disorder problems in the city, and that we should be concerned about them. The question is really whether or not aggressive policing is either the most effective or the most just way of going about this. It's extremely expensive to put people into the criminal justice system over taking up 2 seats on a subway or riding a bicycle on the sidewalk. And it has a lot of long-term negative consequences for those folks. What we need to do is explore ways of dealing with those problems that don't rely so heavily on policing and courts. In general, I think policing should be viewed as a kind of last resort with these kinds of situations rather than the first resort. The other aspect of this is that it's not really so clear often what the harm is that's being addressed. We've seen a lot of videotapes recently of people being arrested for taking up 2 seats on the subway at 4 o'clock in the morning when there's no one else on the subway. It's become a part of a kind of quota, paper-pushing game where the police are out there to get those arrests and write those tickets rather than really addressing a public safety issue.
Though couldn't you, and just extending on your example of the 2 seats on the subway, isn't that really a mechanism to stop people from using the subway to sleep as a homeless shelter?
Well, that's a great example. In some cases, it's not. What's been shocking is that these are people on their way home from work who maybe have fallen asleep or are literally only taking up 2 seats, not laying down on the whole bench. But for those folks who are homeless, living in the subway system, is policing really the best answer for dealing with that? You put someone in the jail at Rikers Island, it costs the city about $500 a night to run that facility per bed, plus the time of police officers, courts, etc. Why can't we be putting those resources into civilian outreach workers and real places for people to stay so that they're not interfering with the functioning of the subway?
A fair point when it comes to the people who are falling asleep on the subway, Professor, but how would you then address people committing low-level crimes that impact other New Yorkers or impact other people short of going through the criminal justice system?
Well, I think it depends on what we're talking about. I think we need to take more of a kind of harm reduction approach, which by that I mean let's try to identify exactly what the harm is that we're concerned about, like access to the subway or usable parks. And then we need to develop strategies that involve all of the services that the city could possibly provide, rather than just viewing this as a policing problem. So, for instance, we have a lot of mentally ill people on the streets in New York, police dealing with a lot of calls for emotionally disturbed persons. And a lot of these interactions end up going very badly, with either officers or the person in distress ending up injured. And what we need to do is, I think, look at examples from other cities around the world where they try to rely primarily on civilian teams to make the initial response, and then the police can be there as a backup. So I think you mentioned low-level marijuana arrests. That's the #1 reason that young people of color end up in the criminal justice system. And I think we need to move towards legalization.
Well, you and I are on the same page on that one. And again, I think we would both agree that that's a relatively victimless crime, as opposed to some of the other examples we're talking about. I want to shift quickly, if I can, to militarized policing. You wrote an impassioned or a very detailed piece in The Nation against the use of militarized policing. Is it really a question of having the material and the training that is led to what we saw on the streets of Ferguson, or is it the implementation, how and when those more militarized units are used, and that we're perhaps misusing those resources?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter, Andrew. Interestingly, here in New York, we don't really have such a problem about militarized policing. We do own some of that kind of equipment, but we really have restricted the usage of that equipment to a very small number of situations. For instance, when the United Nations is meeting, you might see some armored jeeps. You might see a few officers with automatic weapons. And I think everyone feels like that's a legitimate use of this kind of more intensive military type tactics. What we don't see in New York so much is the use of those things just to serve a search warrant or to make an arrest on a drug trade kind of case, or at demonstrations. And I think in a lot of police departments around the country, there's been a real problem with mission creep, which is they got this material under the pretext of anti-terror and are now using it for routine patrols to serve warrants, et cetera. And I think that's where they've gone astray. Well,
these are both topics that we've covered extensively here on RFL. I'm sure we will continue to, and we'd love to have you up here on the panel so you can take part in a longer conversation. But for now, we got to leave it there. Professor Alex Vitale, Associate Professor, Department of Sociology at Brooklyn College. Professor, thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
So the professor was talking about something of almost a social worker solution to some of these issues. Boy, you could solve some of the problems with people sleeping on the subway if you brought in social workers and found help for them. Does anybody think that would actually solve some of these problems that broken windows addresses?
Absolutely not. I'm only going to deal with I don't know what this professor was talking about, to be honest with you. But when it comes to the homeless issue on the subway, it's an issue. I don't care how much of a bleeding heart liberal you might be, or I might be, whoever the case might be. It's very irritating when you are in the train and someone, as I was earlier this week, and someone next to you or right in the vicinity of you, it's very sad, and all the things that comes with that. And that's why I believe the NYPD focuses on that no taking 2 seats rule, because oftentimes the person will lean over and they happen to be taking up 2 seats and nobody wants to go near them. There's no doubt about it. Graffiti's back. Squeegee men are back. Does anybody here at this table like squeegee men? No. I'm sorry. I don't.
Times Square guys.
I don't want you coming up to my car. Today, I'm sitting there, this dude scared the hell out of me. Walking up to my car, the window was up, asking me for money.
So what do you do with those
folks? You
folks?
do what Giuliani did.
You do what Giuliani did. Arrest them and lock them up?
What Giuliani did. You crack down. You crack down. There's no other way around it. What's the liberal way about doing this? What? We're going to throw money into it, and I mean, what do you do? What else do you do?
I think, we're using this word broken windows to apply to a wide range of offenses. I think it's really, I don't buy that. I really believe in smart policing. I think that squeegee people who are basically, harassing people for money, just like anyone else who harass and intimidate for money, that's an offense. And people should be arrested and prosecuted for it. Sleeping, a working person who leans over and is on 2 seats on a subway, To me, that's sort of dumb policing to arrest somebody who's coming home from work and tips over. That's not broken windows. Broken windows was about getting at these essential quality of life crimes that actually were crimes, not made up things, that were criminal offenses that led to a system of a breakdown of social order. And I think that when it's appropriate, good policing has that in it.
But it does, to a certain degree, on a wider scale, seem a little incongruous that if somebody's spraying graffiti on the side of a building, they could wind up locked up for a day or two. I mean, is that too much punishment?
Well, I mean, I think it is in general, right? Every case is different in specifics, but the idea of broken windows is that you literally fix the broken windows in vacant buildings in a neighborhood, thereby reducing the incentive for people to squat in those buildings and commit other petty street crimes.
So you're saying it's more about making sure that replacing the windows that are broken and painting over the
right, painting over the graffiti than it is about coming in with, you know, militarized police and kicking the doors down on everybody.
They took those trains offline. When the train came in, had graffiti on it, they took it offline to clean it up before they put it out. So it was more of the perception.
When we get the headlines on this, the tragic headlines, the Garner case headlines, or the woman who was barbecuing and apparently got the chokehold, or what we saw in Ferguson, it has to deal with the interaction with police as much as it is deciding to enforce the issue in the first place. Is that the solution here? Better interaction between the police and people, figuring out a way to not resort to this garbage, to come up with less invasive ways of dealing with folks, less violent ways of dealing with folks, even if they decide, I'm going to give the cops a hard time when they try to arrest me?
I think so much of it has to do with leadership and training of police officers. I believe in high-quality leadership avoids many of the problems that we saw. In Ferguson, it was clear the police chief, in my opinion, was not capable of the situation that was before him. He reacted poorly and made poor judgments. New York, you know, regardless of what happened afterwards, they were smarter about the way they dealt with the community. You need strong leadership that's smart, recognizes communities are complex, and you need police officers who are trained about the use of force and make smarter decisions.
Yeah. You know, Andrew, my wife gets mad at me when I say this, but I really want to know, is there anybody here at this table that does not object to squeegee men and think it's okay?
No, we all said we object.
Okay, because I mean, when Giuliani, you can say whatever you want about him, but there are many of us that felt that he was doing the right thing. In terms of, now maybe the tone of the police needed to change, but there are certain issues, and it is going back. All you have to do. Yesterday when I was on the train, I was entertained, and I didn't want to be, for about 5 minutes with these kids jumping up and down and all over the poles, performing, begging for money.
Let me ask you one more question, Dominic, and since I'm addressing it to you, I think you know where this is probably headed. I saw a video today.
No.
No. Saw a video today, and I tweeted it, so you can go to my Twitter account and find it.
I will.
Of an arrest in St. Paul, Minnesota, from January of this year. Black man sitting on a public bench in a public area, basically arrested for sitting there because he wouldn't give his name to the police officer.
That often happens in communities of color.
So when we're talking about these broken windows arrests, when we're talking about these very low-level arrests, how much of this is in your mind police being able to keep one over minority communities of color?
That's what happens quite a bit, and that's why there's a tremendous problem, because people of color feel that they have no rights. The officer can do anything that they want, and you can normally tell when it's a arrest that doesn't really warrant anything. Interference with governmental operation, resisting arrest. That means that for whatever reason, the officer decided you're a jerk and you're going in. And then sometimes you're not a jerk. Maybe you ask that officer for his badge and badge number. In communities of color, that's enough sometimes to have you arrested.
Yeah. Again, head over to my Twitter site. There's a link to it in there. Decide for yourself. Imagine what it would be like being the guy in that video, basically getting arrested for sitting on a park bench. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, some in the media have turned on Senator Kirsten Gillibrand after she shared accounts of sexism, the something called sexual harassment, that came from her fellow colleagues, male colleagues in the U.S. Senate. How common is that behavior, even in our seats of power? And should the senator give us names to back up the stories? We're going to ask those questions next.